So let me introduce the solution to you. What if we would use a dirty little trick? Here in my components folder, I'll add a new subfolder, helpers. I'll name it helpers because that best describes which kind of component I'm going to add. I'm going to add a wrapper component. I'll name the file wrapper.js. And in there, I won't even import React because I'm not going to write any JSX code in there. Instead, I'll just create my wrapper component, get props, and have my function body, and export this wrapper. And now you might be wondering what I'm going to do here if I'm not writing any JSX code. Well, I'll just return props.children. Remember, the children prop holds all the content you're passing between the opening and closing tag of your custom component. Now, it is valid in a component to just return that content which you got between the opening and closing tags. And now I can import my wrapper. For example, here in add user, I can import wrapper from helpers wrapper. And I can use it as a regular React component. So I can go down there and replace my div, which has no other meaning than fulfilling this JSX requirement, with my wrapper. So I'm using my wrapper component here. And just to make this really clear again, this is basically an empty component. Everything it does is that it returns props children. But this is enough to fulfill this requirement JSX has. If I save this, my application still works just fine. And it works just fine because in add user, we have a wrapping element. Sure, it's an element which won't render anything to the DOM, but the requirement is not that there must be one root component being rendered to the DOM. The requirement just is that there must be one root element that you return or that you store in a constant or variable. And that's what we're doing here. We have one root element, the wrapper, and what we pass into that wrapper may be adjacent. That is okay, as I explained. Now, of course, all that content is taken and just returned here, but that's also okay because in this return statement, I technically still only return one thing. I return the value in props children. And this can be tough to wrap your head around, but this is just a technical requirement of JavaScript around which we're working here. I just work around that requirement by returning one thing here and one thing here. And of course, what we get here in props children will be that adjacent content, but that will not be a problem because I never directly return that in my code. And this will therefore work just fine. This will not cause any errors, as you can clearly tell. Now that's a nice little trick for solving this problem, because if we now have a look at the Elements tab, and therefore at the DOM, which is actually being rendered, we see that if I inspect my add form component, here's my form, we see there is a div around it, but that's just this card div. But what we also see is if I click add user, that this modal div is being added, but around that, we do have a wrapping div, but this is actually the div coming from the app component, where I also have the wrapping div. This is not coming from inside the add user component. Instead, from inside there, nothing is being rendered in the real DOM. We got the card, and above that, nothing. Because again, this div, which is above it, is coming from the app component. And that is, of course, pretty sweet.